Before the great city could rise on the shores of the Bosphorus, the world that would birth it had to be forged in the crucible of a profound and existential crisis. The Roman Empire of the 3rd century was a fractured and bleeding giant, a shadow of the Augustan peace that had defined its golden age. For a period of 50 years, beginning in 235 AD, the imperial purple became a death shroud, with more than 20 men claiming the title of emperor, only to be cut down by assassins, rival armies, or the very soldiers who had raised them to power. This era of the barracks emperors shattered the illusion of stability, as the legions became the sole arbiters of political destiny, auctioning the throne to the highest bidder or the most ruthless commander. The consequences of this unending civil war were catastrophic. The empire's economy, once the marvel of the world, collapsed into a state of hyperinflation. Successive emperors, desperate to pay the soldiers who kept them in power, systematically debased the silver coinage, reducing the precious metal content of the denarius to almost nothing. Prices spiraled out of control, trade ground to a halt as the currency became worthless, and a primitive barter economy re-emerged in lands that had known sophisticated commerce for centuries. On the frontiers, the empire's preoccupation with internal conflict left it perilously exposed. To the east, the aggressive Sasanian Empire of Persia pressed relentlessly on the provinces of Syria and Mesopotamia, while along the Rhine and Danube rivers, confederations of Germanic tribes, like the Goths and Alemanni, grew bolder, launching deep and destructive raids into Roman territory. The empire was simply too vast, its problems too numerous, for a single ruler to manage from a distant capital. It was from this chaos that a soldier of humble Illyrian origins, Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, seized power in 284 AD. Diocletian was a pragmatist of immense talent, a man who understood that the old system was irrevocably broken. He recognized that the empire's core disease was a structural one, requiring not just a stronger emperor, but a new model of governance. His solution was radical and unprecedented: the tetrarchy, or the rule of four. In 293 AD, he formalized a system that divided the empire into two halves, east and west. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. He ruled the East as the senior emperor, or Augustus, and appointed a trusted colleague, Maximian, as Augustus of the West. He then went further, appointing a junior emperor, or Caesar, for each half Galerius in the East and Constantius in the West. This division of labor was designed to provide localized, responsive leadership to every threatened frontier. More importantly, it was meant to solve the succession crisis. Upon the retirement of an Augustus, his Caesar would ascend, appointing a new junior in turn. While the tetrarchy itself would not long survive its architect, Diocletian's iron will had arrested the empire's death spiral. He had redefined the role of emperor from first citizen to absolute monarch, and, in cleaving the Roman world in two, he had laid the administrative foundations upon which a new Eastern capital would eventually rise to prominence. Diocletian's carefully constructed tetrarchy, designed to ensure stability, disintegrated into another round of civil wars almost immediately after his abdication in 305 AD. From this renewed struggle for supreme power emerged the formidable figure of Constantine, the son of the Western Caesar, Constantius. Proclaimed Augustus by his troops in Eboracum, modern-day York, in 306 AD, Constantine consolidated his power in Gaul and Britain before embarking on the audacious campaign that would define his legacy. In 312 AD, he marched his army over the Alps into Italy to confront his rival Maxentius, who controlled Rome. It was on the eve of this decisive confrontation that a pivotal event occurred. According to the contemporary Christian author Lactantius and the later historian Eusebius, Constantine experienced a vision. He saw a symbol of the cross superimposed on the sun, accompanied by the Greek words "Pasniou Tomicroni Tawafe, ni Kappa Alpha, or in its Latin form, in hoc signo vinces. In this sign you will conquer. Following this divine injunction, he ordered his soldiers to paint the Chi Rho, a monogram of the first two letters of Christ's name, onto their shields. The subsequent clash occurred at the Milvian Bridge, a key crossing over the Tiber River just north of Rome. The battle was a tactical masterpiece for Constantine and a disaster for his rival. Maxentius's forces were outmaneuvered and pushed back toward the river. The temporary pontoon bridge they had constructed for their own advance collapsed under the weight of the panicked retreat, and Maxentius himself, clad in heavy armor, drowned in the muddy waters of the Tiber. Constantine's victory was absolute, and he entered Rome as the undisputed ruler of the Western Empire. The following year, in 313 AD, he met with Licinius, the Augustus of the East, in Milan. Together, they issued the proclamation that has become known as the Edict of Milan. This landmark decree did not establish Christianity as the state religion, but it did officially end all persecution and granted the faith a new legal status. It mandated religious tolerance for all cults across the empire and ordered the restoration of all property that had been confiscated from Christian communities during Diocletian's great persecution. This edict was a revolutionary turning point. With a single political act, Constantine had transformed the Christian faith from an illicit, persecuted sect into a legitimate and soon-to-be favored institution of the Roman state. The power of the eagle, the traditional symbol of Roman martial might, was now inextricably linked with the sign of the cross, setting in motion a cultural and spiritual transformation that would create the very soul of the future Byzantine Empire. Following his final victory over Licinius at the Battle of Chrysopolis in 324 AD, Constantine became the sole master of the entire Roman Empire. With absolute power secured, he turned to a project of monumental ambition, the foundation of a new imperial capital. The old Rome, though still imbued with immense symbolic prestige, was strategically obsolete. It was far from the critical military frontiers of the Danube and the Persian East, and remained a stronghold of a traditional pagan senatorial aristocracy, often at odds with the new Christian direction of the empire. Constantine required a Nova Roma, a new Rome, positioned to govern the wealthier, more populous eastern provinces and to serve as the administrative and military hub for a reoriented world. His selection of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium was a masterstroke of strategic genius. The site was a natural fortress, a triangular peninsula protected by the Sea of Marmara to the south and the deep inlet of the Golden Horn to the north, leaving only a single defensible landward approach from the west. Crucially, it commanded the Bosphorus Strait, the sole maritime passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, giving it absolute control over vital trade routes. On November 8, 324 AD, Constantine formally traced the boundaries of his new city, quadrupling the size of the old Byzantium. A colossal building program commenced, fueled by the vast resources of the empire and a levy on its provinces. To adorn his capital, Constantine systematically stripped priceless artwork, statues, obelisks, and columns from pagan temples and public squares across the Greek East. He expanded the existing hippodrome to a scale that rivaled Rome's Circus Maximus and constructed new administrative centres, including the Great Forum of Constantine. At its centre stood a towering porphyry column, topped with a statue of the emperor in the guise of Apollo Helios, a syncretic image that reflected the transitional religious nature of his reign. Unlike the old capital, however, the new one was conceived as a Christian city from its inception. While some older temples were respected, Constantine's primary architectural focus was on the construction of magnificent churches, such as the original Hagia Irene. To populate this new metropolis, he offered powerful incentives. Aristocratic families were enticed to move from Rome with promises of palaces and hereditary estates, while the general populace was attracted by the offer of a free daily ration of bread, an entitlement known as the annona. On May 11, 330 AD, the city was formally consecrated as Constantinople, This act was more than the founding of a new administrative centre. It was a deliberate shift in the empire's centre of gravity. It was the creation of a Christian, Greek-speaking, and commercially dominant capital that would serve as the enduring heart of the Roman world for the next 1,000 years. Constantine's patronage had granted the Christian faith legal status, but it soon became apparent that the Church was far from a monolithic entity. It was racked by profound internal divisions over the very nature of its central figure, Jesus Christ. The most disruptive of these controversies was ignited by Arius, a presbyter from Alexandria, who taught that the Son of God was not eternal, but had been created by the Father. This doctrine, which posited that there was a time when he was not, effectively made Christ a subordinate, semi-divine being, challenging the developing concept of the Holy Trinity. The dispute was not a quiet, scholarly affair. It spilled into the streets of major eastern cities like Alexandria and Antioch, causing riots and deep social unrest. For Constantine, who saw a unified church as a crucial pillar for his unified empire, this theological discord was an intolerable source of political instability. Determined to impose order, he utilized his imperial authority to convene the first ever ecumenical council in 325 AD. Over 300 bishops, overwhelmingly from the eastern provinces, gathered in the city of Nicaea. Constantine himself presided over the opening session, setting a powerful precedent for imperial involvement in ecclesiastical matters. The primary task of the Council of Nicaea was to resolve the Arian question. The assembly overwhelmingly condemned Arius's teachings as heresy. To create a definitive statement of Orthodox belief, the bishops formulated a creed. The central and most contentious element of this Nicene Creed was the Greek term homoousios, meaning of one substance or consubstantial. Its inclusion was a precise and deliberate piece of theological engineering, asserting that the Son was of the very same divine essence as the Father, not merely a similar one. This left no room for Arian subordination. But Nicaea was not the end of the debate. It was the beginning of a new phase of conflict. Arianism and various semi-Arian positions would remain powerful for decades, with several of Constantine's own successors championing the condemned doctrine. The council did, however, establish a foundational methodology for the Christian empire. It institutionalized the practice of defining universal doctrine through imperially sponsored councils, a process that would be repeated over the centuries to address subsequent Christological debates, such as the nature of Christ's divine and human wills. By intervening directly to codify belief, Constantine had irrevocably fused the power of the state with the structure of the Church, creating the unique politico-religious identity that would define Byzantium. The emperor was now not only the protector of the faith, but a crucial arbiter in its definition. The decades following the Constantinian dynasty were marked by endemic instability and the ever-present threat of barbarian incursions along the vast frontiers. This period of crisis culminated in the disastrous Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, where the Eastern Emperor Valens and the bulk of his army were annihilated by Gothic invaders. It was into this chaos that Theodosius the Great ascended to the throne, a skilled general tasked with salvaging a desperate situation. His reign was notable for two critical developments. First, unable to eject the Goths militarily, he established a new precedent by settling them within imperial territory as autonomous allies, or foederati. Second, he was a fervent Nicene Christian who moved decisively beyond Constantine's policy of tolerance. With the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD, he made Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire, aggressively suppressing both Arianism and the last vestiges of public pagan worship. The unity he temporarily enforced was, however, fragile. Upon his death in 395 AD, Theodosius made a fateful decision that would permanently alter the course of history. He bequeathed the empire jointly to his two sons. The elder, Arcadius, was to rule the eastern provinces from Constantinople, while the younger, Honorius, would govern the western provinces from Milan and later Ravenna. While the empire had been administratively divided before, this division proved to be final. Never again would a single emperor effectively rule the whole Roman world. From this point forward, the two halves drifted apart on fundamentally different trajectories. The West was militarily and economically fragile, its armies increasingly dependent on barbarian generals like Stilicho, and its territories under constant pressure from Germanic tribes crossing the Rhine and Danube. Its economy, based on vast agricultural estates, was in decline. The East, by contrast, was far more resilient. It possessed the empire's wealthiest provinces, a larger population, a more sophisticated administrative bureaucracy, and a capital that was a commercial powerhouse and an impregnable fortress. The cultural and linguistic divide also became a chasm. The court in Constantinople operated in Greek, and its intellectual life was dominated by Greek theological debates and classical philosophy. The West remained fundamentally Latin. This linguistic barrier hindered communication and fostered a sense of separate destinies. The division of 395 was not merely administrative, it was the formal acknowledgement of a reality that had been developing for a century. It set two Roman worlds on separate paths, one headed for collapse and fragmentation, the other poised to endure, evolve, and carry the legacy of Rome forward for another 1,000 years. The sack of Rome by Alaric's Visigoths in 410 AD sent a profound shockwave across the entire Roman world. While the Western Empire crumbled, the Eastern court in Constantinople recognized that its own capital, which had expanded far beyond its original Constantinian circuit, was dangerously exposed. In response, during the minority of Emperor Theodosius II, the highly capable Praetorian prefect Anthemius initiated one of the most ambitious and successful defensive projects in history. Beginning in 413 AD, construction commenced on a new line of fortifications, a single, massive curtain wall stretching approximately 6.5 kilometers from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. This structure was an engineering marvel, standing nearly 12 meters high and 5 meters thick, fortified with 96 imposing towers placed at regular intervals. The wall's construction utilized a sophisticated composite technique, alternating layers of limestone blocks with courses of Roman brick, all bound with a core of mortar and rubble. This method provided immense strength and, crucially, a degree of flexibility that made it resilient to the seismic activity common to the region. The strategic landscape changed dramatically 3 decades later with the rise of Attila the Hun, whose armies posed an existential threat. Just as this menace reached its peak, a catastrophic earthquake in 447 AD toppled vast sections of the wall and destroyed 57 of its towers. With Attila's forces ravaging the Balkans and demanding tribute, the city was left catastrophically vulnerable. In this moment of extreme crisis, the Praetorian prefect Constantine organized an emergency effort of legendary speed and scale. He mobilized the entire city, including the demes, the powerful factions of the Hippodrome, in a race against time. In a mere 60 days, the population not only fully repaired the damage to the original wall, but dramatically enhanced the entire system. A second, outer wall was constructed, standing roughly 8.5 meters high, complete with its own set of towers deliberately placed to cover the gaps between the towers of the inner wall. This addition created a heavily defended terrace, or peribolos, between the two ramparts, designed as a lethal kill zone for any attacker who breached the first line. Beyond this, a wide, brick-lined moat, over 20 meters across, was excavated, creating a formidable third obstacle. This triple-layered defense system moat, outer wall and inner wall, was the most sophisticated fortification of its age. It rendered Constantinople impregnable to direct assault from the land for over a millennium, ensuring its survival against successive waves of Avar, Arab, Bulgar, and Rus sieges, and cementing its status as the ultimate guardian of Roman civilization in the East. While the Theodosian walls secured Constantinople, the Western Empire entered a terminal phase of disintegration throughout the 5th century. Its survival was undermined not by a single cataclysm, but by a slow, inexorable process of political fragmentation and economic strangulation. The most critical blow was the loss of North Africa. In 429 AD, the Vandals crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and by 439 had captured Carthage, seizing the Western Empire's wealthiest provinces and its primary source of grain. This conquest severed the economic artery of Italy and deprived the state of the tax revenue essential for funding its armies. With its financial base crippled, the government in Ravenna became incapable of fielding effective forces to defend its remaining territories in Gaul and Spain, which were progressively overrun by Visigoths, Franks, Suebi, and Burgundians. Real power in the West devolved from the emperors to a series of powerful barbarian generals, the magistri militum, who commanded the remnants of the army. The most capable of these was Flavius Aetius, who for 2 decades skillfully played barbarian groups against each other to maintain a semblance of imperial authority. His crowning achievement came in 451 AD at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, where he forged a coalition of Roman and Visigothic forces to halt the advance of Attila the Hun into Gaul. It was a significant military victory, but it was also the last great effort of Roman arms in the West. The fragile stability shattered in 454 AD when the paranoid Emperor Valentinian III assassinated Aetius, only to be assassinated himself months later. This act of self-sabotage plunged the Western government into chaos. The Vandal king Gaiseric seized the opportunity, sailing from Carthage in 455 and subjecting Rome to a second, far more destructive, 2-week sack. For the next 2 decades, the Western Empire was a political fiction, with a succession of powerless shadow emperors installed and deposed by the Suebian general Ricimer. Imperial authority had effectively vanished outside of Italy. The final act came in 476 AD. The Germanic chieftain Odoacer, leading a federation of barbarian troops, deposed the last Western emperor, a boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus. Crucially, Odoacer did not proclaim himself emperor or appoint another puppet. Instead, he sent the Western imperial regalia, the diadem, scepter, and purple robes to Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, formally acknowledging that the Roman world now had only one emperor. The West had fallen, leaving Constantinople as the sole, undisputed heir to the Roman legacy. The dawn of the 6th century saw the Eastern Empire in a state of stable consolidation, but the imperial throne itself was subject to the vagaries of succession. The death of the childless Emperor Anastasius in 518 AD created a power vacuum that was filled by a most unlikely candidate. Justin, an aging, illiterate Illyrian peasant who had risen through the military ranks to become the commander of the imperial guard. His accession marked the founding of the Justinianic dynasty, but the true architect of its future was not Justin himself, but his nephew, Flavius Petrus Sabatius. Born around 482 AD in the village of Taurasium in Dardania, a region in the Latin-speaking Balkans, Petrus Sabatius was of humble stock. His life was transformed when his uncle Justin, already established in Constantinople, summoned him to the capital. There, the young man received a superb education, immersing himself in jurisprudence, theology, and Roman history, acquiring a formal polish and deep intellectual grounding that his uncle completely lacked. During Justin's 9-year reign, the nephew who took the name Justinian was the effective power behind the throne. While the old emperor managed the ceremonial duties, Justinian, shrewd and tirelessly energetic, directed the machinery of the state. He held a series of critical posts, including consul and commander-in-chief of the armies in the east, Magister Militum per Orientem, using these positions to build a network of loyal officials and generals. By 525, he had been granted the title of Caesar, and in the final months of Justin's life in 527, he was elevated to Augustus, becoming co-emperor and ensuring a seamless transfer of power. When he formally ascended to the throne as sole ruler, Justinian was no untested novice, but a master of statecraft in his mid-40s, fully prepared to unleash his monumental ambitions. He was driven by a powerful and all-consuming vision: the Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, or the restoration of the Roman Empire. In his eyes, the Germanic kingdoms that now occupied North Africa, Italy, and Spain were not legitimate successor states, but temporary illegal occupants of rightful Roman territory. Possessing an almost superhuman capacity for work and an unshakable belief in his divine mandate, he saw it as his sacred duty to reclaim these lost lands, to purify Christian doctrine, and to rationalize Roman law, thereby restoring the empire to its former glory and universal dominion. The stage was set for one of the most transformative and consequential reigns in Roman history. Justinian's ambition was matched, and in moments of crisis surpassed, by that of his wife Theodora. Her origins were from the lowest stratum of Byzantine society, a world far removed from the imperial court. Her father, Acacius, was a bear-keeper for the Green faction at the Hippodrome, and upon his death, her mother thrust her and her sisters into the theatre to survive. In the 6th century, an actress was synonymous with a prostitute, and Theodora's early career on stage, as detailed with venomous relish by the historian Procopius in his Secret History, was one of public scandal. While Procopius's accounts are undeniably hostile and exaggerated, they nonetheless point to a youth spent in a profession that left her legally infamous and socially ostracized. However, her life took a decisive turn during a trip to North Africa. There, she experienced a profound religious conversion to Miaphysite Christianity, a non-Chalcedonian doctrine considered heretical by the imperial church. This newfound piety accompanied a formidable intellect and an iron will. Upon her return to Constantinople, she captivated Justinian, then the heir apparent. Their union was a legal impossibility. A law dating back to Constantine forbade men of senatorial rank from marrying actresses. Demonstrating his resolve, Justinian had his uncle, Emperor Justin I, repeal this specific law in 524 AD. They were married in 525, and when Justinian ascended the throne in 527, Theodora was crowned Augusta beside him. She was no mere consort but a co-ruler in fact as well as in name. Her name appeared alongside Justinian's in legislation, and she took an active role in statecraft. She established her own court, received foreign envoys, and pursued her own distinct political and religious agenda. Her Miaphysite faith often placed her in opposition to her husband's official Chalcedonian orthodoxy. She skillfully used her influence to protect Miaphysite bishops and clergy from persecution, effectively running a parallel religious policy from within the palace. Furthermore, she was a fervent champion of social reform, driving legislation that prohibited forced prostitution, established convents to house former prostitutes, expanded the property rights of women, and granted them more power in divorce cases. Theodora was Justinian's most indispensable advisor, intelligent, ruthless, and politically astute, a true partner in the governance of the empire. Theodora's resolve would be tested to its absolute limit in January of 532 AD, when the city of Constantinople erupted in an urban insurrection that nearly shattered the empire. The catalyst was the arrest and scheduled execution of members from both the Blue and Green Hippodrome factions for murders committed during a previous riot. The two demes, usually bitter rivals, found rare common cause in their opposition to the city prefect. At the chariot races on January 13th, their unified chants turned from sporting cheers to political demands. When these were ignored, the crowd exploded in fury, their unified cry of Nika, meaning conquer or win, becoming the slogan of a full-blown rebellion. The uprising was not merely the work of a lawless mob, it was fueled by widespread aristocratic and popular discontent with Justinian's high taxes and the perceived corruption of his key ministers, the jurist Tribonian and the praetorian prefect John the Cappadocian. For 5 days, the city burned. The mob, now an organized insurrection, torched the praetorium, the baths of Zosippus, and the original church of Hagia Sophia, reducing much of the monumental heart of the capital to ashes. On the 5th day, the rioters forced the reluctant senator Hypatius, a nephew of the former emperor Anastasius, to the Hippodrome and proclaimed him emperor. With a rival Augustus acclaimed just yards from the palace, Justinian's regime was on the verge of collapse. Inside the Great Palace, panic set in. Justinian and his advisors prepared for ignominious flight across the Bosphorus. It was at this critical juncture that Theodora intervened. Refusing to flee, she delivered a speech that altered the course of history, famously declaring that the imperial purple made a fine burial shroud. Her unyielding courage shamed the wavering emperor and his council into action. Galvanized, Justinian entrusted the suppression of the revolt to his most capable generals, Belisarius and Mundus. They acted with ruthless efficiency. While Mundus secured the palace exits, Belisarius led his troops through the fire-gutted streets to the hippodrome, blocking the main gates and trapping the rebels inside. The imperial soldiers then entered the arena and carried out a systematic massacre. By the end of the day, an estimated 30,000 people had been killed. Hypatius was captured and executed. The Nika riots were over, and Justinian's authority was now absolute, secured in blood and iron. With his authority secured, Justinian turned to an ambition that would prove more enduring than any military conquest: the rationalization of Roman law. Over a millennium of Roman history, the body of law had become a chaotic, unmanageable accretion of statutes, senatorial decrees, praetorian edicts, and the often contradictory writings of classical jurists. It was a vast and impenetrable legal jungle. In February 528 AD, less than a year into his reign, Justinian appointed a commission of 10 jurists, led by the brilliant but controversial quaestor Tribonian, to impose order on this chaos. This monumental project, completed with astonishing speed, would ultimately be known as the Corpus Juris Civilis. The first part was the Codex Justinianus, a comprehensive collection of all imperial constitutions still in force. The commission sifted through centuries of imperial edicts, eliminating obsolete or contradictory laws and harmonizing the remainder into a single authoritative volume of 12 books, which was published in 529 AD. The most intellectually demanding component was the digest, or pandects. A second commission, again under Tribonian's direction, was tasked with the immense challenge of surveying the entire corpus of classical Roman legal writing, some 3 million lines of text from jurists like Ulpian, Papinian, and Paul. Their mandate was to extract the essential principles of law, edit out inconsistencies, and compile the results into 50 books. This massive work of systematization, completed in just 3 years and promulgated in 533 AD, preserved the core of Roman legal genius for posterity. Published alongside the digest were the Institutes, a concise introductory textbook for first-year law students, modelled on the work of the 2nd century jurist Gaius. It provided a systematic overview of the principles detailed in the larger works, ensuring the next generation of lawyers and administrators would be trained within this new unified framework. The final part of the corpus was the Novelli Constitutiones, New Laws, a collection of the legislation issued by Justinian himself after 534 AD to address new circumstances. While the military reconquests would prove ephemeral, this colossal legal codification was Justinian's most lasting achievement. It preserved the sophisticated legal heritage of Rome, and after its rediscovery in Italy in the 11th century, it became the primary foundation for the civil law systems that govern most of modern Europe. The ashes of the Nika riots provided Justinian with a tabula rasa upon which to project his imperial and theological vision. Where the old Theodosian Basilica of Hagia Sophia had stood, he resolved to build a church that would surpass any monument ever constructed. The project, initiated just 40 days after the riots were suppressed in 532 AD, was not entrusted to conventional master builders. Instead, Justinian appointed 2 Greek scientists, Anthemius of Tralles, a physicist and expert in geometry, and Isidore of Miletus, a mathematician and professor of stereometry. Their mandate was to create a structure that defied known architectural limitations. The scale of the enterprise was unprecedented. employing over 10,000 labourers who worked in shifts around the clock. The construction was completed with astonishing speed, taking just 5 years, 10 months, and 4 days from foundation to dedication. Justinian spared no expense, importing materials from across the empire: green marble from Thessaly, porphyry from Egypt, and yellow stone from Syria. The central architectural problem was how to place a massive circular dome over a square base. The solution was the pendentive, a curved triangular vault that seamlessly transferred the immense weight and thrust of the dome to 4 colossal piers at the corners of the square. This innovation allowed for an interior space of breathtaking scale, uninterrupted by columns. The first dome, with a diameter of over 31 meters, was a relatively shallow saucer shape. At its base, the architects pierced a ring of 40 arched windows, which, combined with the gold mosaic interior, created the optical illusion that the dome was not resting on the building, but was suspended from heaven by a golden chain. This effect was the church's defining feature, a tangible representation of divine light entering the earthly realm. Upon its dedication on December 27, 537 AD, the Hagia Sophia immediately became the undisputed center of Orthodox Christianity. However, the initial design proved structurally flawed. An earthquake in 558 AD caused the original dome to collapse. The task of rebuilding it fell to Isidore the Younger, nephew of the original architect, who engineered a new, higher and more stable ribbed dome with a steeper curve, which is the one that stands today. The finished structure was more than a church. It was a physical manifestation of imperial theology, a masterpiece of engineering, and the enduring symbol of Byzantine civilization. With his domestic projects launched, Justinian's grand ambition of Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire, turned westward. The first target was the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. The pretext came in 530 AD, when the pro-Roman Vandal king Hilderic was deposed by his cousin Gelimer. In 533 AD, Justinian dispatched his most trusted general, Belisarius, with a modest expeditionary force of around 15,000 men. The campaign was a stunning success. Landing unopposed, Belisarius decisively defeated the Vandal army at the Battle of Ad Decimum and again at Tricomarum. Gelimer fled and surrendered the following year. In a single campaign season, the wealthy and strategic province of Africa was restored to imperial rule after a century of Vandal control, a victory that exceeded all expectations. Buoyed by this triumph, Justinian turned his attention to the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy. The assassination of the pro-Byzantine Ostrogothic queen Amalasuntha in 535 AD provided the necessary justification for war. Belisarius, fresh from his African victory, led the invasion, quickly securing Sicily before landing on the Italian mainland. The Gothic War, however, would be a far more arduous and destructive conflict than the swift Vandal campaign. Belisarius captured Naples and then Rome in 536 AD, but soon found himself besieged in the ancient capital for over a year by a massive Gothic army under King Vitiges. Belisarius's brilliant defense held, and by 540 AD he had pushed north and captured the Gothic capital of Ravenna, seemingly concluding the war. This victory was an illusion. The Goths rallied under a new charismatic leader, Totila, who launched a highly effective guerrilla campaign that reversed most of Belisarius's gains. A brutal second phase of the war engulfed the peninsula for another decade, inflicting far more devastation than the initial invasion. The conflict bled the empire's treasury and manpower dry. Although the Byzantines were ultimately victorious after Belisarius was replaced by the eunuch general Narses, who finally defeated and killed Totila at the Battle of Taginae in 552 AD, the price of victory was catastrophic. The Italian peninsula was left depopulated, its economy shattered, and its cities in ruins. The hard-won reconquest would prove tragically fleeting, as the exhausted province fell to Lombard invaders just 3 years after Justinian's death. Just as Justinian's military ambitions reached their zenith, a biological catastrophe of unprecedented scale emerged from the south to shatter the foundations of his restored empire. In the spring of 541 AD, the first reports of a deadly pestilence surfaced in the Egyptian port of Pelusium, the nexus of the imperial grain supply. Modern paleogenetics has identified the pathogen as Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, making this the first historically recorded pandemic of its kind. Carried by the fleas on black rats that infested the grain ships, the plague spread with terrifying efficiency along the empire's vital trade arteries. By 542 AD, it had reached Constantinople, where it erupted with unimaginable fury. The contemporary historian Procopius, an eyewitness to the horror, described its clinical symptoms in detail: sudden high fevers, delirium, and the appearance of grotesque bubonic swellings, or buboes, in the groin, armpits, and neck. Death often followed within days. At the pandemic's peak in the capital, the death toll reportedly reached 5,000, and later 10,000, people per day. The city's administrative functions collapsed as burial systems were overwhelmed. Bodies were left in the streets before being disposed of in mass graves or cast into the sea. The plague was not a singular event. It was the first and most virulent wave of a pandemic that would recur periodically for more than 2 centuries. It is estimated that this initial outbreak killed between 25% and 50% of the population in the affected regions. The demographic collapse had catastrophic and immediate consequences. The imperial army, which was already stretched thin across multiple fronts, was decimated, halting the progress of the Gothic War and making it impossible to effectively garrison the reconquered territories. The empire's economy and tax base were crippled. With a drastic shortage of agricultural labor, fields went uncultivated, leading to widespread famine and a sharp decline in state revenue. Justinian's ambitious building programs and costly wars became fiscally unsustainable. The scourge of God's wrath permanently altered the strategic and demographic landscape, leaving behind a weakened, depopulated empire that lacked the human and financial resources to sustain the grand restoration its emperor had envisioned. The demographic and fiscal exhaustion following Justinian's era left the empire critically exposed on its eastern frontier, where its traditional rival, the Sasanian Persian Empire, waited. The long peace fractured spectacularly in 602 AD, when the Byzantine army on the Danube mutinied, marched on the capital, and executed Emperor Maurice, elevating a tyrannical centurion named Phocas to the throne. The Sasanian Shah, Khosrau II, who had been an ally of Maurice, used the coup as a pretext to launch a massive war of conquest. The initial Persian onslaught was devastating. Under the incompetent rule of Phocas, the eastern armies collapsed. The strategic fortress of Dara fell in 605, opening Anatolia to Persian raids. In 610, Heraclius, the son of the Exarch of Africa, overthrew Phocas, but he inherited an empire on the brink of total annihilation. The Persian advance was relentless. Antioch fell in 613, followed by the catastrophic capture of Jerusalem in 614. The Sasanians sacked the holy city, massacred its inhabitants, and seized the most sacred relic in Christendom, the true cross, carrying it back to their capital, Ctesiphon. This act transformed the conflict into a holy war. By 619, the Persians had conquered Egypt, severing Constantinople's vital grain supply and starving the capital. For a decade, Heraclius methodically rebuilt the state and the army, using church treasures to finance his efforts. In 622, instead of confronting the Persian armies in Anatolia, he launched a daring counter-offensive, sailing his army into the Black Sea to strike deep into the Persian rear in Armenia. This high-stakes gamble left Constantinople vulnerable, and in 626, a combined Persian and Avar army laid siege to the capital. The city's defences and the Byzantine navy held, repelling the assault. Meanwhile, Heraclius continued his campaign in the Persian heartland, forging an alliance with the Turks and systematically destroying Sasanian military power. The final decisive engagement came at the Battle of Nineveh in December 627, where Heraclius personally led his troops to a shattering victory over the main Persian field army. The defeat led to the overthrow of Khosrau II. The subsequent peace treaty in 628 restored all Byzantine territories and, most importantly, returned the True Cross to Jerusalem. The victory was total but Pyrrhic. 2 decades of apocalyptic warfare had left both empires utterly depleted, their treasuries empty, and their armies exhausted, making them tragically unprepared for the new, unified force that was about to erupt from the deserts of Arabia. While the Byzantine and Sasanian empires licked their wounds from a generation of mutually destructive warfare, a profound socio-political and religious transformation was consolidating in the Arabian Peninsula, a region long considered a peripheral buffer zone. For centuries, Arabia had been characterized by political fragmentation, dominated by nomadic Bedouin tribes and a handful of trading cities like Mecca, which served as a major polytheistic pilgrimage center. Around 610 AD, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, a merchant from the Quraysh tribe in Mecca, began to preach a message of radical monotheism. These revelations, later compiled in the Quran, called for an absolute submission, Islam, to the will of a single, all-powerful God, Allah, a concept that directly challenged the entrenched political and economic structures of Meccan society. Facing persecution, Muhammad and his followers undertook the Hijra, or migration, to the city of Medina in 622 AD. There he established the first Ummah, a unified political and religious community governed by Islamic principles. Through a combination of diplomacy, tribal alliances, and a series of successful military campaigns, he unified the disparate and perpetually warring tribes of the Arabian Peninsula under this new banner. Upon Muhammad's death in 632, leadership passed to his close companion Abu Bakr, who assumed the title of caliph, or successor. His immediate challenge was suppressing the Ridda Wars, a series of uprisings by Arab tribes who considered their loyalty personal to Muhammad, not to the nascent Islamic State. Having successfully reconsolidated control over the peninsula, the caliphate redirected this unified military energy outwards. The Arab armies that erupted into Byzantine Syria and Sasanian Iraq were not disorganized raiders, but a cohesive force, ideologically motivated and highly mobile. Their tactics, centered on light cavalry and camel-mounted infantry, exploited the vast, arid frontier zones between the two empires. The professional heavy armies of Byzantium and Persia, exhausted from their recent conflict and trained for conventional set-piece battles, were strategically and tactically unprepared for the speed and ferocity of this new threat. The initial Arab campaigns were stunningly successful, marking the arrival of a third major power that would irrevocably shatter the old world order of late antiquity. The stunning success of the initial Arab campaigns was a prelude to a swift and irreversible imperial collapse. The Byzantine response to the threat in Syria was initially conventional. Emperor Heraclius dispatched a large, professional field army, a multi-ethnic force of imperial regulars, Armenian contingents, and allied Ghassanid Arabs to crush the invaders. The decisive confrontation occurred in August 636 on the plains of the Yarmouk River. The Byzantine numerical superiority was rendered irrelevant by the tactical genius of the Arab commander, Khalid ibn al-Walid. He exploited the terrain and a sudden sandstorm to envelop and annihilate the imperial army over a 6-day battle. The defeat at Yarmouk was not just a military loss, it was a strategic catastrophe that effectively eliminated Byzantium's ability to defend the entire Levant. With the main field army destroyed, the fortified cities of the region were left isolated and vulnerable. Damascus had already fallen in 635, and after Yarmouk, the rest of Syria and Palestine collapsed like dominoes. The process was accelerated by deep-seated religious alienation within these provinces. The majority of the local Semitic populations were Monophysite, or Nestorian Christians, who had been persecuted for their theological differences with the Chalcedonian orthodoxy enforced by Constantinople. For many, the arrival of the Muslim Arabs, who initially offered religious tolerance and lower taxes in exchange for submission under the dhimmi system, was preferable to continued rule from a hostile imperial government. Jerusalem surrendered to Caliph Umar in 637, and Antioch, the great metropolis of the Roman East, fell the same year. The loss of these provinces, which had been integral parts of the Greco-Roman world for 7 centuries, was a profound demographic, economic, and psychological blow. The disaster was compounded by the invasion of Egypt in 639, led by the Arab general Amr ibn al-As. Egypt was the empire's wealthiest province, its primary source of grain for the capital, and a major center of naval power. After the key fortress of Babylon fell, the provincial capital of Alexandria, the second city of the empire, capitulated in 642. Within a single decade, the Byzantine Empire had permanently lost 2/3 of its territory and population, and a far greater proportion of its tax revenue. The ancient geography of the Roman world was shattered, forcing the surviving state into a desperate, centuries-long struggle for its very existence. Having swallowed the empire's eastern provinces, the Umayyad Caliphate under Muawiyah shifted its strategic objective from territorial conquest to decapitation, the capture of Constantinople itself. This required a fundamental pivot from land-based warfare to the creation of a formidable navy capable of challenging Byzantine maritime supremacy. After seizing naval bases across the eastern Mediterranean, including Cyprus and Rhodes, the Caliphate launched its first major assault in 674. This was not a single, massive attack, but a sustained, multi-year blockade. The Arab fleet established a winter base at Cyzicus in the Sea of Marmara, launching annual campaigns against the city's sea walls each spring. For 4 years, the capital endured this relentless pressure, a war of attrition designed to exhaust its defenders and starve them into submission. The city's survival depended not only on its formidable fortifications but on a revolutionary technological advantage: Greek fire. This secret incendiary weapon, a petroleum-based mixture projected through siphons, was unleashed upon the blockading fleet with devastating effect. It could burn on water, creating a literal wall of fire that consumed ships and crews alike, shattering Arab morale. The blockade collapsed in 678, a stunning defeat for the Caliphate. A generation later, a second, even more determined effort was made. In 717, the Umayyads assembled the largest expeditionary force of the era, a massive army and navy under the command of Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, with the explicit goal of extinguishing the empire. The timing seemed perfect, as Byzantium was racked by internal anarchy. However, a brilliant general, Leo the Isaurian, seized the throne as Leo III just as the invasion began. He orchestrated a masterful defense. The Arab land army was held at bay by the Theodosian walls, while the navy was once again crippled by Greek fire as it attempted to blockade the Golden Horn. The siege dragged on into the exceptionally brutal winter of 717-718, for which the Arab forces were unprepared. Trapped in their camps, they suffered catastrophic losses from starvation and disease. The decisive blow came from an unexpected quarter. Fulfilling a treaty with Leo, Khan Tavel of Bulgaria led his army to attack the Arab rear, inflicting a crushing defeat. When a relief fleet arrived from Egypt and North Africa, it too was destroyed by the Byzantine navy. In 718, the shattered remnants of the Arab force withdrew, having suffered one of the most comprehensive disasters in military history. The failure of the sieges was a pivotal event, halting Umayyad expansion into Europe and ensuring the survival of the Byzantine state as a bulwark for centuries to come. The technological innovation that proved decisive in the defense of Constantinople was a closely guarded state secret known as Greek fire. Its development is traditionally attributed to a Christian refugee from Syria, an architect and chemist named Callinicos of Heliopolis, who brought his knowledge to the capital around 672, just before the first great Arab siege. While incendiary weapons had existed since antiquity, the Byzantine formula represented a quantum leap in chemical warfare. The precise composition remains one of history's most enduring mysteries, as its production was compartmentalized and protected by oaths of secrecy punishable by death. Modern analysis and historical accounts suggest its primary component was a petroleum or naphtha base, which was likely distilled and refined. This was mixed with other substances, possibly including sulfur, pine resin to act as an adhesive, and quicklime, which would react exothermically with water, making the mixture notoriously difficult to extinguish. The true genius of the weapon, however, lay not just in its chemical properties, but in its delivery system. The Byzantines developed a complex apparatus known as a siphon, a bronze tube mounted on the prow of their naval vessels, the dromons. This device was connected to a heated, pressurized tank below deck. A force pump, operated by a crew, would propel the heated liquid through the nozzle, which was often shaped like the head of a lion or other beast, adding a psychological component to the attack. When the superheated liquid was ejected, it would ignite upon contact with the air, producing a jet of flame accompanied by a tremendous roaring sound and thick, acrid smoke. Its tactical deployment was devastatingly effective in naval combat. Unlike conventional fire arrows, Greek fire could be aimed with a degree of accuracy, and its semi-liquid nature meant it would adhere to the wooden hulls and sails of enemy ships. Its most terrifying property was its ability to burn on water, preventing enemy sailors from dousing the flames or finding refuge by jumping overboard. This gave the numerically inferior Byzantine navy a decisive asymmetrical advantage, effectively neutralizing the massive fleets assembled by the Umayyad Caliphate. The strategic importance of this weapon cannot be overstated. It was the empire's ultimate deterrent, a technological marvel that single-handedly secured naval supremacy and saved the capital from what seemed like certain annihilation during the sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries. The catastrophic loss of the empire's richest provinces necessitated a radical internal restructuring for the surviving state to endure. The late Roman system, which strictly separated civil and military authority, was no longer financially or strategically viable. Facing constant, deep-penetrating Arab raids across Anatolia and a shattered tax base, the state could not afford to pay a large, mobile professional army. The solution, which evolved out of desperation during the mid-7th century, likely under Emperor Constans II, was the thematic system. This was a fundamental reorganization of the state at its core. The remnants of the old imperial field armies, the Presental armies, the army of the East, the army of Armenia, were permanently settled in the Anatolian provinces they were tasked with defending. The provinces themselves were then renamed after these military units, giving rise to the first great themes: the Opsikion, the Anatolikon, and the Armeniakon. The defining feature of this new system was the fusion of civil and military administration under a single military governor, the strategos or general, who held supreme authority in his theme. This streamlined the chain of command, allowing for a rapid and localized response to enemy incursions without waiting for orders from the capital. The economic foundation of the themes was equally revolutionary. Instead of receiving regular cash salaries, which the treasury could no longer provide, soldiers, stratiotai, were granted inalienable plots of agricultural land. These military homesteads were hereditary, but ownership was conditional upon the family providing a soldier for the thematic army in each generation. This innovation solved multiple crises simultaneously. It relieved the state of its greatest financial burden, created a self-sufficient and decentralized military force, and fostered a highly motivated army of freeholding farmers defending their own homes and land. The result was a profound militarization of Anatolian society. No longer was defense the sole purview of distant professionals, it became a local responsibility. The system created a resilient defense, in-depth strategy. While Arab raiding parties could still penetrate the frontier, they would be constantly harassed by local thematic troops who would attack their foraging parties and strike as they attempted to withdraw, laden with plunder. This radical transformation from a centralized salaried army to a decentralized land-based military was the key to Byzantium's survival, creating a resilient heartland that could absorb the shock of constant warfare and provide a stable foundation for the empire's future recovery. The 2 decades of chaos preceding 717 had seen the throne change hands 7 times, crippling the state's ability to govern. From this anarchy emerged Leo III, a seasoned general from the Anatolican theme, likely of Syrian or Anatolian, not Isaurian origin. He seized the throne at the most critical moment, just as the massive Umayyad land and sea forces were converging on Constantinople. His immediate legacy was forged in the successful defense of the capital, a feat achieved through masterful diplomacy, including a crucial alliance with the Bulgar Khan Tervel and decisive military leadership. With the existential Arab threat repulsed, Leo dedicated his reign to comprehensive reform aimed at rebuilding the shattered state. His most significant legal achievement was the promulgation of the Ecloga in 726. This new law code was a radical departure from Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. Written in Greek rather than Latin, it was a more concise and practical legal manual intended for everyday use by judges. It was also deeply infused with a new Christian moralism, introducing concepts of equity and increasing the use of corporal mutilation as punishment for a wide range of crimes, reflecting a belief in penance over simple retribution. Administratively, Leo solidified the thematic system, subdividing some of the larger original themes like the massive Opsikion to curb the power of their ambitious generals and prevent rebellions. He also overhauled the fiscal apparatus, creating a new system of taxation that was more efficient and less susceptible to the corruption that had plagued his predecessors. Yet, his most consequential and divisive act was the initiation of iconoclasm. In 726, influenced perhaps by his Eastern origins where aniconic religious traditions were stronger, and possibly believing that the veneration of images was idolatry that had provoked divine wrath, Leo began his campaign. He ordered the removal of the prominent icon of Christ from the chalk gate of the Great Palace, an act which immediately provoked riots among the city's populace. This was not merely a theological dispute. It was a direct challenge to the immense wealth and political influence of the monasteries, which were the primary producers and defenders of icons. The conflict escalated until 730, when Leo issued a formal edict banning the veneration of all religious images throughout the empire. This decree fractured Byzantine society, creating a deep and violent schism between the iconoclast emperors, supported largely by the army, and the iconophile monks and populace. The policy also triggered a definitive break with the papacy in Rome, which staunchly condemned the emperor's actions. Thus, Leo III's reign presents a profound duality. He was the restorer of the state who ended the 20 years' anarchy, but also the architect of a century-long internal crisis that would tear the empire apart from within. While the empire's attention was fixed on the existential struggle against the Sasanian and later the Arab caliphates in the east, a profound and irreversible transformation was quietly occurring in its European heartlands. Unlike the dramatic military invasions of the past, the Slavic migrations into the Balkans were a slower, more insidious process, a demographic tide rather than a single conquering wave. Beginning in the late 6th century and accelerating throughout the 7th, numerous politically fragmented Slavic groups crossed the Danube frontier. This frontier, once one of Rome's most heavily fortified, had been systematically stripped of its veteran legions to fight the wars in the east, leaving behind a porous border manned by second-rate troops. The Avar Khaganate, a formidable nomadic power based in the Pannonian Basin, often acted as a catalyst. The Avars conducted their own destructive raids deep into Byzantine territory, sometimes forcing Slavic tribes to move south as refugees, and at other times employing them as auxiliary forces. Over decades, what began as raids evolved into permanent settlement. These were not centrally organized conquests, but the inexorable advance of small agrarian communities seeking new lands. They filtered into a Balkan peninsula that had been repeatedly devastated by warfare and depopulated by the Justinianic plague, finding vast tracts of abandoned farmland. Byzantine sources refer to these territories as the Sclaviniae, the lands of the Slavs, acknowledging a de facto loss of imperial control over the hinterland. The empire, fighting for its very survival against Arab armies in Anatolia, lacked the resources to mount a serious response. Imperial authority effectively collapsed across the interior, retreating to a handful of fortified coastal cities like Thessaloniki and the immediate environs of the capital. This silent inundation permanently altered the ethnic and linguistic map of Europe. The Latin and Greek-speaking populace of the inland Balkans was largely displaced or assimilated, creating a vast Slavic demographic bloc that severed the land routes between Constantinople and the west. This was not a loss of a province in a single battle, but the gradual erosion of an entire civilization's footprint, leaving the empire a coastal and archipelagic power in its own European territories, surrounded by a Slavic sea. The policy initiated by Leo III was dramatically intensified and given theological force by his son and successor, Constantine V. A brilliant general and a fervent believer, Constantine transformed iconoclasm from a series of imperial edicts into a systematic, empire-wide persecution. The core of the iconoclast argument, refined under his reign, was that any image of Christ was inherently heretical. They reasoned that a painting could not depict Christ's divine nature, and to depict only his human form was to fall into the Nestorian heresy of separating his two natures. Therefore, any veneration directed at a physical object, a construct of wood and paint, was nothing less than idolatry, a direct violation of the second commandment. To codify this doctrine, Constantine convened the Council of Hieria in 754. Attended by 338 bishops, all carefully selected, the council formally anathematized the veneration of religious images and condemned prominent iconophile theologians. Though it was never recognized by Rome or the wider Orthodox Church, Hieria provided the imperial government with the theological justification for a brutal campaign of enforcement. The persecution was methodical and violent. Across the empire, imperial agents were dispatched to destroy sacred art. Mosaics were chipped from church walls, icons were publicly burned, and frescoes were systematically whitewashed, often replaced with secular imagery such as chariot races, hunting scenes, or simple crosses. The primary targets of this persecution were the monks, who formed the backbone of iconophile resistance. Monasteries were dissolved, their vast land holdings were confiscated by the state, and their members were forced to break their vows. Those who resisted faced public humiliation, blinding, exile, or execution. The struggle was fundamentally a battle for control over the soul of the empire. The iconoclast emperors sought to assert the supremacy of the state over the church, breaking the immense economic and political power of the monastic establishment. The army, particularly the thematic troops from Anatolia, remained the staunchest supporters of the iconoclast emperors, seeing the policy as a purification of the faith that would restore divine favor and military victory. This imperial policy plunged the empire into a bitter civil war, fought not on a battlefield, but in the churches and monasteries, creating a deep and violent schism that would define Byzantine life for the next century. The imperial assault on images was met not with silent submission, but with a fierce and highly sophisticated intellectual counteroffensive. The most formidable defense of sacred art came from a theologian living safely beyond the emperor's reach, within the territory of the Umayyad Caliphate. From Damascus, the civil servant and monk John of Damascus formulated the definitive iconophile theology. In his treatises, he meticulously crafted a distinction between latreia, the absolute worship due only to God, and proskynesis, the reverential veneration that could be offered to holy things, including icons. John argued that the incarnation of Christ had fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with the material world, because the divine word had taken on physical flesh. Matter itself was sanctified and could serve as a conduit for divine grace. He countered the iconoclast charge of idolatry by asserting that the honor paid to an image passes on to its prototype. For the largely illiterate populace, he stressed the pedagogical function of icons, famously calling them books for the illiterate and silent preachers of the gospel. His works were systematically smuggled into the empire, providing the intellectual ammunition for the resistance. Within Byzantine territory, the epicenter of this opposition was the monastic world. Monks became the primary producers of icons, the authors of iconophile polemics, and ultimately the most prominent martyrs for the cause. Figures like Theodore the Studite, abbot of the influential Studios monastery in Constantinople, organized the monastic resistance, corresponded with the papacy, and endured exile for his unwavering defense of images. The opposition from Rome was absolute and immediate. Popes like Gregory II and Gregory III engaged in a bitter correspondence with the iconoclast emperors, formally condemning their policies in councils and offering refuge to iconophile exiles. This papal stance solidified the theological position of the iconophiles and deepened the political and ecclesiastical chasm between Rome and Constantinople. The resistance was not only fought with ink and councils, but also through acts of civil disobedience. Believers hid sacred images, conducted secret services, and faced down imperial officials. The brutal persecution created a new generation of martyrs, whose stories were recorded and circulated, strengthening the resolve of the iconophile faction and framing the conflict as a struggle between pious believers and a heretical, tyrannical state. This combination of profound theological argument, organized monastic defiance, and popular piety created a resilient opposition that the military might of the emperors could not ultimately extinguish. The death of Emperor Leo IV in 780 left the imperial throne to his 9-year-old son, Constantine VI, but placed real power in the hands of the boy's mother, the Athenian-born Empress Irene, a secret iconophile who had navigated the courts of 2 iconoclast emperors. Irene now held the regency and began a slow, deliberate campaign to reverse a half-century of imperial policy. Her primary obstacle was the military establishment, particularly the powerful thematic armies of Anatolia, which remained fiercely loyal to the iconoclast doctrines of their victorious soldier emperors. Recognizing this, Irene spent her initial years consolidating power, methodically purging iconoclast generals and officials while promoting known iconophiles to positions of authority. Her masterstroke was the appointment of her trusted secretary, the layman Tarasios, as Patriarch of Constantinople, on the explicit condition that he would convene a new ecumenical council. After a failed first attempt in the capital was broken up by iconoclast troops, Irene astutely moved the assembly in 787 to Nicaea, a location deliberately chosen to evoke the authority of the first great council of the Church. At this Second Council of Nicaea, attended by papal legates from Rome, the theological work of John of Damascus was formally canonized. The bishops condemned the Council of Hieria as a fraud and officially restored the veneration of images, meticulously defining the practice of proskynesis to avoid any charge of idolatry. The political fallout of this religious restoration was immense. As her son Constantine VI reached maturity, he grew resentful of her continued dominance, leading to a bitter power struggle. The conflict culminated in 797, when Irene orchestrated a conspiracy to have her own son arrested, deposed, and blinded, a brutal act that disqualified him from rule and led to his death. Following this, she took the unprecedented step of ruling not as regent or empress consort, but as the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, adopting the masculine title Basileus. This assertion of female sovereignty was revolutionary in Constantinople and utterly rejected in the West. Pope Leo III, viewing the throne as legally vacant, used it as a primary justification for crowning Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day in 800, creating a rival Western empire and shattering the political unity of the Roman world forever. Irene's historic reign, however, would end not by foreign invasion but by internal intrigue. In 802, she was deposed by a palace coup and exiled to the island of Lesbos, where the first woman to rule the Romans in her own right died in obscurity. Irene's restoration of the icons proved to be a fragile victory. Following her deposition, a second, more moderate wave of iconoclasm was reinstated by Emperor Leo V the Armenian in 815, once again driven by military factions who attributed imperial defeats to divine displeasure over image veneration. This revival culminated in the reign of the final iconoclast emperor, Theophilos, a ruler who was both a sophisticated patron of the arts and a convinced persecutor of iconophiles. His death in 842, however, created a familiar political vacuum, leaving the empire to his infant son, Michael III. Real power passed to a regency council headed by the boy's mother, Empress Theodora, who, like Irene before her, was a devout but secret iconophile. Learning from Irene's mistakes, Theodora orchestrated the final restoration with far greater political skill and speed. Supported by the powerful eunuch minister Theoktistos, she carefully secured the backing of the civil bureaucracy and key court officials. The primary obstacle was the intransigent iconoclast patriarch, John the Grammarian, a formidable scholar who had been Theophilus's tutor. Theodora and her allies convened a synod in Constantinople in March of 843. John the Grammarian was summoned, and after refusing to abandon his iconoclast position, he was formally deposed. In his place, the regency appointed the iconophile Methodios, a confessor who had been imprisoned and flogged for his faith during the recent persecution. With the patriarchate secured, the synod moved swiftly to reaffirm the canons of the Second Council of Nicaea, definitively condemning iconoclasm as a heresy. The restoration was sealed with a carefully staged public ceremony on the first Sunday of Lent, March 11, 843. A grand procession, with the Empress, the young Emperor Michael, Patriarch Methodios, and clergy carrying icons aloft, marched from the Blachanae Palace to the Hagia Sophia. There, in the empire's grandest church, the icons were formally restored to their place of honor, bringing the long and violent struggle to a definitive end. This event, which permanently settled the place of images within Orthodox worship and theology, is still commemorated annually in the Eastern Orthodox Church as the Sunday of Orthodoxy, a celebration of the final victory over the last great heresy to convulse the Byzantine world. The end of iconoclasm ushered in an era of cultural revival, but the imperial court remained a place of dangerous instability. The improbable rise of Basil I began during the reign of Michael III, an emperor who was more interested in debauchery and chariot racing than in governance. Basil's origins were obscure. He was born to a peasant family of Armenian descent in the theme of Macedonia around 811. Possessed of immense physical strength and a natural charisma, he travelled to Constantinople as a young man to seek his fortune. His entry into the imperial circle was the result of his skill as a horse tamer. He subdued an unruly stallion belonging to a courtier, which brought him to the attention of the Emperor Michael himself. Michael, impressed by Basil's strength and charmed by his personality, quickly made him a trusted companion. Basil's ascent was meteoric. He was appointed Parakoimaminos, the emperor's chief chamberlain, a position that gave him unparalleled access to the monarch and control over the palace. However, the true power behind the throne was Michael's uncle, the brilliant and capable Caesar Bardus, who effectively ran the state. To secure his own position, Basil convinced the suggestible emperor that Bardus was plotting to usurp him. In 866, with Michael's tacit approval, Basil personally participated in the public assassination of Bardus during a military campaign. The removal of Bardus left a power vacuum that Basil immediately filled. Just a month later, Michael III, increasingly dependent on his favourite, adopted Basil as his son and crowned him co-emperor. For over a year, the peasant and the legitimate heir of the Amorian dynasty ruled together. But the relationship was volatile. Michael's erratic behaviour and heavy drinking made him unpredictable, and he began to resent Basil's growing influence. Fearing that the emperor who had made him could just as easily destroy him, Basil made a preemptive strike. On September 24, 867, Basil led a small group of conspirators into the imperial bedchamber and murdered Michael III as he slept. The next morning, the former peasant stable hand stood before the court as the sole Augustus, the founder of a new dynasty. His path to the throne was paved with manipulation and 2 assassinations, yet his reign would initiate a golden age of Byzantine power that would last for nearly 2 centuries. Having secured the throne through bloodshed, Basil I proved to be a remarkably effective and conscientious ruler, redirecting the empire's resources away from internal conflict and towards systematic reconsolidation. The military revival under the early Macedonians was not one of sudden, dramatic conquest, but a slow, methodical grinding down of its enemies. In the east, the primary adversary remained the Abbasid Caliphate and its semi-independent emirates. Basil's generals, most notably Nikephoros Phocas the Elder, began a patient but relentless offensive in Anatolia, pushing the frontier eastward by capturing key fortresses like Tefrike, the stronghold of the Paulician heretics. This strategy of attrition warfare focused on securing strategic positions rather than seeking decisive field battles, gradually restored Byzantine control over long-lost territories. Simultaneously, a significant effort was made to rebuild the imperial navy, which had decayed significantly. New fleets were constructed, and naval commanders began to challenge Arab supremacy in the Aegean, launching raids against the Emirate of Crete and securing the sea lanes vital for commerce and communication. This naval resurgence was critical for projecting power into the west. In southern Italy, Byzantine forces launched a major counteroffensive against both the remaining Lombard principalities and the Arab incursions from Sicily. Imperial armies successfully re-established Byzantine authority over Calabria and Apulia, laying the administrative groundwork for what would become the Catapanate of Italy. This western recovery secured a vital foothold in the Italian peninsula and protected the Adriatic coast from further raids. This external expansion was underpinned by profound internal reforms. Basil I initiated a complete overhaul of the empire's legal system, commissioning a revision of Justinian's code to create more accessible and practical legal handbooks, the Prochiron and the Epinagoge. This legal consolidation provided administrative consistency and strengthened the authority of the state. The dynasty also focused on fiscal stability, reforming the tax system to ensure a steady flow of revenue to the treasury, which in turn funded the revitalized military. The political climate stabilized as the Macedonian emperors provided decades of competent dynastic rule, ending the chaotic cycle of coups and short-lived reigns that had plagued their predecessors. This prolonged period of internal order allowed the empire to harness its full economic and military potential, transforming it from a beleaguered state fighting for survival into an expansionist power once again on the offensive. The political and military security established by the Macedonian dynasty provided the foundation for a profound intellectual and artistic revival. This cultural flourishing, often termed the Macedonian Renaissance, was not merely an outburst of new creativity, but a conscious and systematic effort to recover, preserve, and synthesize the empire's classical Greek and Roman heritage after the long, sterile winter of iconoclasm. A central figure in this movement was the Caesar Bardus, who in the mid-9th century re-established the Imperial University in the Magnora Palace, creating a state-funded institution of higher learning. This university became the heart of the revival, led by the brilliant polymath Leo the mathematician. Scholarship shifted towards an encyclopedic impulse, a desire to collect and systematize all knowledge. The Patriarch Photios the Great exemplified this spirit with his monumental Bibliotheca, a collection of summaries and critiques of 280 classical texts, many of which have since been lost, making his work an invaluable window into the ancient world. This intellectual fervor was enabled by a crucial technological innovation, the widespread adoption of minuscule script. This new, compact cursive writing was faster to produce and easier to read than the old uncial script, leading to a dramatic increase in the production of manuscripts and ensuring the survival of a vast corpus of ancient Greek literature, philosophy, and science. Imperial patronage was essential, particularly under Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos. A scholar and writer himself, He commissioned encyclopedic works on statecraft, diplomacy, and imperial protocol, such as De Administrando Imperio and De Ceremoniis, preserving a priceless record of Byzantine governance. In the visual arts, the end of iconoclasm unleashed a new wave of creativity. A new architectural form, the cross-in-square church, became the standard for religious buildings. In churches like the Nea Ecclesia, imperial workshops produced breathtaking mosaics that re-established figural representation at the center of religious art. This new style blended the hierarchical solemnity of Christian theology with a renewed appreciation for classical harmony, naturalism, and grace. Lavish illuminated manuscripts, such as the Paris Psalter, and intricately carved ivory caskets explicitly juxtaposed biblical scenes with classical allegories and mythological figures, demonstrating a sophisticated confidence in integrating the pagan past with the Christian present. This deliberate revivalism defined Byzantine high culture and cemented its role as the primary custodian of classical learning for the remainder of the Middle Ages. Beyond direct military reconquest, the Macedonian emperors pursued a sophisticated foreign policy of cultural and religious expansion to secure the empire's northern frontiers. This strategy of soft power found its most consequential success among the Slavic peoples and the formidable traders and raiders known as the Rus. The groundwork was laid in the 860s, when at the request of the Moravian prince Rastislav, Constantinople dispatched two brothers from Thessaloniki, Constantine and Methodius. Fluent in the local Slavic dialects, their mission's primary obstacle was the absence of a written language. To overcome this, Constantine, later known as Cyril, invented the glagolitic alphabet, a completely new script tailored to the sounds of Slavic speech. This act was revolutionary. It allowed for the translation of the Gospels and liturgical texts into the vernacular, creating a Slavic literary language and empowering a native clergy, a stark contrast to the Latin-based missions of Frankish priests. While their Moravian mission was ultimately thwarted by political rivalries with the papacy and the German Empire, the script they created, later simplified into Cyrillic, would become the vehicle for Orthodox Christianity's spread throughout Eastern Europe. A more formidable target was the Kievan Russes, a Varangian-led state whose fleets had raided Constantinople itself. The relationship alternated between violent conflict and lucrative trade. An early breakthrough occurred around 957 with the baptism of Princess Olga of Kiev in the imperial capital, but this remained a personal conversion, not a state policy. The decisive moment came under her grandson, Prince Vladimir the Great. According to the Rus's primary chronicle, Vladimir sought a monotheistic faith to unify his people and dispatched envoys to observe the religions of neighboring states. It was the report from Constantinople that proved decisive. His men described the liturgy in Hagia Sophia as a divine experience, stating they knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. Yet, the final conversion was sealed by a calculated political bargain. In 987, Vladimir agreed to provide Emperor Basil II with 6 elite Varangian warriors to crush a rebellion. In exchange, Vladimir demanded an unprecedented prize, the hand of Basil's own sister, the purple-born Princess Anna Porphyrogenita. To secure this marriage, Vladimir formally adopted Orthodox Christianity, and in 988 he commanded the mass baptism of his subjects in the Dnieper River. This single event irrevocably tied the destiny of the Rus to the Byzantine cultural and religious sphere, shaping the identity of Eastern Europe for a millennium. The apex of Macedonian military power was embodied in the long and unforgiving reign of Basil II. His ascent was not immediate. For nearly the first 2 decades of his rule, he was consumed by a series of devastating civil wars against the powerful Anatolian military aristocracy, led by Bardas Skleros and Bardas Phokas. Basil only secured his throne in 989, after crushing the rebellions with the crucial aid of 6,000 Varangian warriors from the Kievan Rus, a brutal consolidation of power that left him with an unshakable distrust of the nobility and an absolute dedication to the authority of the state. With his domestic position secured, he turned his full, relentless attention to the empire's most formidable adversary, the resurgent Bulgarian Empire under the capable Tsar Samuel. The conflict was not a single campaign, but a grueling war of attrition that lasted for over 30 years. After a humiliating early defeat at the gates of Trajan in 986, Basil abandoned conventional field battles in favor of a systematic scorched earth strategy, leading annual campaigns deep into Bulgarian territory to methodically reduce its fortresses and destroy its economic base. The war reached its horrific climax in 1014 at the Battle of Clydian. The Bulgarian army had heavily fortified the Clydian Pass, blocking the main invasion route. Basil's forces were at an impasse until his general, Nikephoros Gyphius, led a force through the mountains to attack the Bulgarians from the rear, resulting in a total Byzantine victory. Approximately 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers were captured. What followed was an act of calculated psychological warfare that earned Basil his infamous epithet. He ordered that the prisoners be blinded in groups of 100, with every 99 men completely blinded, and the 100th man left with a single eye to guide the rest back to their Tsar. The sight of his mutilated army returning is said to have caused Tsar Samuel to suffer a fatal stroke. With their leadership shattered, Bulgarian resistance crumbled. By 1018, the entire Bulgarian Empire was formally annexed, its territory fully integrated into the Byzantine state for the first time in over 300 years. His settlement, however, was remarkably pragmatic. He integrated the Bulgarian nobility into the Byzantine system and allowed the Bulgarian Church a degree of autonomy. In his final years, Basil further expanded the empire's eastern frontiers, securing new territories from the Fatimids and in the Caucasus. At his death in 1025, he left the Byzantine Empire at its greatest territorial and political extent since the age of Justinian, with a full treasury and secure borders, all achieved through a lifetime of brutal, single-minded devotion to the preservation and expansion of Roman power. The power projecting from the Macedonian throne was administered through a vast and intricate machine of state housed within the great palace of Constantinople. This was not a single building, but a sprawling labyrinthine complex of halls, churches, barracks, and gardens that functioned as the nerve center of the empire. At its heart was a highly professionalized civil bureaucracy, a direct institutional descendant of the late Roman state, which operated with a logic and complexity unparalleled in the medieval world. The administration was divided into specialized departments, or secreta, each headed by a logothetes who controlled a specific aspect of governance, from the general treasury to foreign affairs and the imperial post. An elaborate hierarchy of ranks and titles, meticulously recorded in official precedence lists known as tactica, governed every interaction. This system created a world of constant, subtle competition for status, where one's position during a procession or proximity to the emperor at a banquet was a direct measure of political influence. Court life was governed by a rigid and theatrical ceremonial, a form of political liturgy designed to elevate the emperor from a mere political leader to God's vicegerent on earth. The ritual of proskynesis, the full prostration before the throne, was demanded of all, reinforcing the emperor's quasi-divine status. Foreign ambassadors were deliberately intimidated by the spectacle, as described by Western visitors like Liutprand of Cremona. They would be brought before the throne of Solomon, a marvel of mechanical engineering, which could be raised high into the air, while golden lions at its base roared and mechanical birds chirped in gilded trees. This was not mere pageantry, but a calculated instrument of foreign policy, designed to overwhelm and awe visitors with the empire's seemingly supernatural power and wealth. Access to the emperor was the ultimate currency of power, and it was jealously controlled by a cadre of court eunuchs who held the highest positions of trust, serving as chamberlains and chief ministers. Their unique status, unable to found dynasties of their own, made them theoretically loyal only to the emperor, and they managed the flow of information and personnel within the palace with absolute authority. This entire system, a fusion of rational Roman administration and divinely ordained ceremony, created a self-contained universe where political power was inextricably linked to one's mastery of protocol, intrigue, and bureaucratic procedure, forming the stable, administrative bedrock of the Macedonian Golden Age. The formal separation of the Eastern and Western churches in 1054 was not a sudden rupture, but the dramatic culmination of centuries of accumulating divergence. The linguistic divide between the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West had become a chasm, fostering mutual misunderstanding and suspicion. Politically, the Pope in Rome increasingly asserted a claim to universal jurisdiction over all of Christendom, a primacy of authority that Constantinople was willing to acknowledge only as a primacy of honor among the 5 ancient patriarchates of the Pentarchy. The most significant theological point of contention became the Filioque clause. Western theologians had added the phrase, "and the Son," to the Nicene Creed's statement on the procession of the Holy Spirit, an alteration the East rejected as an unauthorized violation of an ecumenical council's decree and a theological error. Liturgical practices also differed sharply, with disputes arising over the Western use of unleavened bread for the Eucharist, as opposed to the East's leavened bread, and the growing enforcement of clerical celibacy in the West. The immediate crisis was triggered by disputes in southern Italy, a region where Greek and Latin traditions overlapped. The combative patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Kerolarios, condemned Western practices and, in a retaliatory move, ordered the closure of all Latin Rite churches in the capital. In response, the reformist Pope Leo IX dispatched a legation to Constantinople in 1054, led by the equally intransigent Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida. The mission was a diplomatic disaster. Humbert, arriving with a rigid sense of papal supremacy, refused to engage in substantive dialogue, while Kerolarios questioned the legate's authority, correctly noting that Pope Leo had died while they were en route. After months of acrimonious stalemate, the final break occurred on July 16, 1054. Humbert and his fellow legates marched into Hagia Sophia during the afternoon liturgy and placed a papal bull of excommunication upon the high altar, anathematizing Kerolarios and his supporters. In turn, Kerolarios convened a synod that excommunicated Humbert and the papal legation. At the time, these were seen as personal excommunications, not a formal schism between the two churches. Yet, the event became a symbolic point of no return, crystallizing the deep-seated divisions and providing a formal justification for a separation that had, in practice, been growing for centuries. The catastrophic defeat at Manzikert in August 1071 was the result of a cascade of strategic miscalculations and internal treachery. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, determined to permanently halt Seljuk Turkish raids into the empire's Anatolian heartland, assembled a massive and diverse army, numbering perhaps as many as 70,000 men. This force was a complex mosaic of native Byzantine tagmata, thematic levies, and a substantial contingent of foreign mercenaries, including Franks, Normans, and his elite Varangian Guard. This heterogeneity, however, concealed deep-seated political rivalries. Romanos's primary objective was the recapture of the strategic fortress of Manzikert in eastern Armenia. Underestimating the main Seljuk army's proximity under Sultan Alp Arslan, the emperor made his first critical error. He divided his forces, sending a large detachment of nearly 30,000 troops, including many of his best mercenaries, to secure the fortress of Client. This left him with a diminished force to confront Alp Arslan's highly mobile, predominantly cavalry army. On the day of the battle, the Seljuks employed classic steppe tactics, using their horse archers to harass and attrit the heavily armoured Byzantine lines while avoiding a decisive frontal engagement. Romanos, goaded by these hit-and-run attacks, advanced his centre, pushing the Seljuks back throughout the day. However, he failed to achieve a decisive victory. As evening approached, he ordered a tactical withdrawal back to the security of his fortified camp. It was during this complex maneuver that the battle was lost. The rearguard, responsible for covering the retreat, was commanded by Andronikos Doukas, a member of a powerful family with a bitter political rivalry against Romanos. Seeing his opportunity, Doukas deliberately spread the rumor that the emperor had been killed and marched his entire reserve force off the battlefield. The betrayal was immediate and catastrophic. Seeing the Byzantine rearguard in full retreat, other units wavered, and the army's cohesion dissolved. Alp Arslan seized the moment, halting his feigned retreat and launching an all-out assault on the now exposed and disordered imperial centre. The Byzantine army was encircled and annihilated. Romanos IV fought with distinction but was wounded, captured, and brought before the Sultan an unprecedented humiliation. The military loss, while severe, was secondary to the political implosion that followed. Romanos's capture triggered a civil war in Constantinople as the Doukas family seized the throne. This internal chaos paralyzed the empire, preventing any organized military response. The frontier defenses collapsed, and with no imperial army to stop them, nomadic Turkmen tribes poured into Anatolia, initiating the irreversible Turkification and Islamization of the empire's most vital recruiting ground and economic heartland. By 1095, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had achieved a remarkable stabilization of an empire on the brink of dissolution. Inheriting a state fiscally bankrupt and militarily shattered after Manzikert, he had spent over a decade implementing currency reforms, confiscating church assets, and rebuilding the army through a combination of native recruitment and a heavy reliance on foreign mercenaries. His strategic objective was the recovery of Anatolia, but he lacked the elite heavy cavalry needed to confront the mobile Seljuk forces on the open plateau. Consequently, Alexios dispatched envoys to Pope Urban II at the Council of Piacenza with a specific and limited request: the recruitment of Western mercenary knights to serve under his command in exchange for generous pay. This was a standard Byzantine practice, not a plea for a holy war. Pope Urban II, however, saw a far grander opportunity. At the Council of Clermont later that year, he masterfully repurposed Alexios's pragmatic appeal into a call for an armed pilgrimage to liberate Jerusalem. This new concept, a holy war under papal authority, was a uniquely Western idea, motivated by Urban's desire to channel the endemic violence of the Frankish nobility outwards, assert papal supremacy over the entire Christian world, and reclaim the Holy Land. The response in Western Europe was explosive and entirely unforeseen by Constantinople. It was not the manageable contingent of professional soldiers Alexios had requested, but a massive, chaotic migration numbering in the tens of thousands, comprising great lords, minor knights, and a vast multitude of non-combatants. The arrival of these disparate crusader armies at the gates of Constantinople throughout 1096 presented Alexios with an immense logistical and political crisis. He was now faced with a powerful, ideologically fervent, and unpredictable foreign army camped outside his capital. Through masterful diplomacy, he handled the threat by dealing with each crusader leader: Godfrey of Bouillon, the ambitious Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse individually. He compelled them, through a combination of lavish gifts and veiled military threats, to swear an oath of fealty, obligating them to return any former Byzantine territory they conquered to imperial control. In return, Alexios provided vital logistical support and naval transport. This fragile arrangement, built on a foundation of deep mutual suspicion, allowed the emperor to harness this uncontrollable force for his own strategic ends, beginning with the successful joint siege of Nicaea in 1097. Alexios had received the military aid he desperately needed, but in a form so potent and alien it would permanently alter the empire's relationship with the West. The oaths of fealty sworn at Constantinople were violated almost immediately, setting the precedent for a century of fraught relations between the Byzantine Empire and the newly founded Crusader states. The primary point of contention was the Principality of Antioch, captured in 1098. Its conqueror, the Norman Bohemond of Taranto, a long-standing enemy of the empire, refused to honor his pledge and return the city to Byzantine control. This act of blatant opportunism established a permanent geopolitical conflict, as Alexios and his successors, John II and Manuel I Komnenos, were forced to dedicate significant military and diplomatic resources towards reasserting their historical claim over the city. The Komnenian dynasty adopted a consistent, if complex, policy towards these new Latin principalities. They viewed them not as independent allies, but as vassal states, a military buffer against the Seljuks that was ultimately subject to imperial suzerainty. This led to a pattern of interventionist diplomacy backed by force. Emperor John II Komnenos, for instance, led major expeditions into Syria in the 1130s and 1140s, compelling the Prince of Antioch and the Count of Edessa to acknowledge him as their overlord. These campaigns produced temporary submission, but failed to establish permanent control, as the Latins would renounce their vassalage as soon as the imperial army withdrew. Underlying the political maneuvering was a deep cultural and religious chasm. The installation of Latin patriarchs in the ancient sees of Antioch and Jerusalem, displacing their Greek Orthodox counterparts, was a source of profound and lasting resentment. This ecclesiastical rivalry was more than a matter of dogma. It was a struggle for institutional power, property, and influence over the local Christian populations. The Byzantine elite viewed the Franks as uncouth, avaricious barbarians, while the Latins saw the Byzantines, or Greeks, as effeminate, duplicitous, and heretical. Compounding these issues was the growing economic power of the Italian maritime republics. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, having provided the crucial naval power for the Crusades, were rewarded with extensive commercial quarters and trading privileges within the Crusader ports. This created a powerful new economic bloc in the Levant that directly challenged Constantinople's commercial dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean. The precarious alliance was thus a web of conflicting interests, where moments of military cooperation against a common Muslim enemy were invariably undermined by mutual suspicion, broken oaths, and the fundamental clash between the Byzantine goal of imperial restoration and the Latin ambition of independent sovereignty. The foundation laid by Alexios I was systematically built upon by his son, John II Komnenos, a ruler defined by his piety and relentless military focus. John dedicated his 25-year reign to a methodical reversal of the losses following Manzikert. In the Balkans, he permanently neutralized the Pecheneg threat with a decisive victory at the Battle of Beroia in 1122 and reasserted imperial authority over the Serbs and Hungarians. His primary theatre of operations, however, was Anatolia, where he conducted a slow, grinding reconquest against the Danishmends and the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Instead of seeking a single decisive battle, John focused on capturing fortified cities along the coast and securing strategic routes, gradually pushing the Turkish frontier eastward. His efforts successfully reclaimed the entirety of western Anatolia for the empire. His successor, Manuel I Komnenos, inherited a state that was once again a dominant power. Manuel's reign was characterized by a grand, pan-European diplomatic strategy and a personal fascination with Western chivalry. He engaged in a complex web of alliances, marrying German and Crusader princesses, and even attempted an ambitious but ultimately failed reconquest of southern Italy from the Normans. This westward focus, however, diverted critical resources from the Anatolian front. Manuel continued the war against the Seljuks, but his ambitious style contrasted sharply with his father's cautious approach. In 1176, seeking a definitive victory, Manuel led a massive army toward the Seljuk capital of Iconium. Disregarding the advice of his veteran commanders, he allowed his enormous force, encumbered by a large baggage train and heavy siege equipment, to enter a narrow mountain pass near the fortress of Myriokephalon. The Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan II, sprung the ambush perfectly. Trapped in the pass, the Byzantine army was systematically destroyed by Turkish forces attacking from the high ground. The defeat was a strategic catastrophe. While not the complete annihilation of Manzikert, it resulted in the destruction of the elite Komnenian field army, which the empire could no longer afford to replace. The battle psychologically shattered the momentum of the restoration, proving that the Anatolian interior was now irretrievably lost. Manuel's death in 1180 marked the end of the dynasty, and with it, the end of the empire's last great period of resurgence. The restoration had been a remarkable recovery, but its foundations were ultimately too fragile to survive the loss of its architects. The origins of the Venetian Republic were inextricably linked to the Byzantine Empire, born from communities seeking refuge in the lagoons of northeastern Italy, nominally under imperial protection. For centuries, Venice functioned as a loyal if remote client state, its nascent maritime trade dependent on the stability and markets provided by the empire. This relationship fundamentally transformed in 1082, when Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, desperate for naval assistance against the Norman invasions of Robert Guiscard, issued a golden bull granting Venetian merchants unprecedented privileges. In exchange for the use of their fleet, Venetians were given their own commercial quarter in Constantinople, and, most critically, were exempted from all customs, duties, and taxes throughout the empire. This single decree was a catastrophic miscalculation for Byzantine economic sovereignty. It effectively gave Venetian merchants a supreme competitive advantage over the empire's own subjects, allowing them to undersell and outmaneuver native traders in their own markets. Capital that once flowed to the imperial treasury and Byzantine businesses was systematically siphoned into the Venetian economy. This immense wealth funded the expansion of the Venetian arsenal, a state-owned shipyard complex that could produce galleys at an industrial scale, turning Venice into the preeminent naval power in the Mediterranean. The consequences of this economic dependency soon became apparent. Emperor John II Komnenos attempted to curtail Venetian privileges in 1122, leading to a punitive Venetian naval campaign that ravaged Byzantine islands in the Aegean. His successor, Manuel I, tried to counterbalance Venetian power by granting similar, though less extensive, privileges to their rivals, Genoa and Pisa. This only inflamed tensions, culminating in 1171, when Manuel ordered the mass arrest of all Venetians within the empire, perhaps 20,000 people, and the confiscation of their vast properties. While this act temporarily crippled the Republic, it also instilled a deep-seated and institutional desire for revenge. The symbiotic relationship had soured into a bitter rivalry. By the end of the 12th century, Venice was no longer a dependent client, but a formidable maritime empire in its own right, possessing the financial resources and the naval power to act as a kingmaker in Mediterranean politics, a power it would soon turn against its former benefactor, with devastating consequences. The Fourth Crusade, proclaimed by Pope Innocent III in 1198, was initially conceived with a clear strategic objective: the conquest of Egypt, the political and economic heartland of the Ayyubid Sultanate. To achieve this, the Crusades' leaders contracted with the Venetian Republic for the transport of a massive army. The agreement, negotiated in 1201, stipulated an enormous payment of 0 silver marks for the transport of 33 500 crusaders and 4 500 horses. However, the crusading army that assembled in Venice in the summer of 1202 was a fraction of the expected size, numbering only around 12 men. This shortfall created an immediate financial crisis. The Crusaders were unable to pay the contracted sum, leaving them stranded and in debt to the Venetians. It was at this juncture that the Doge of Venice, the aged and blind Enrico Dandolo, proposed a pragmatic but controversial solution. He suggested the Crusaders could defer their debt by assisting Venice in recapturing the rebellious city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, a Christian city under the protection of the King of Hungary, who had himself taken the cross. Despite papal prohibitions, and the threat of excommunication, the Crusaders, seeing no other option, agreed. The fleet sailed in October 1202, and after a brief siege, the Christian city of Zara was sacked. This act earned the entire crusade a formal excommunication from Pope Innocent III. While wintering in the captured city, the crusade was diverted a second, final time. They were approached by envoys of Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II. Alexios made an irresistible offer. If the Crusaders would sail to Constantinople and restore him and his father to the throne, he would pay their remaining debt to Venice, finance their subsequent conquest of Egypt, provide 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for the cause, and, most appealingly to the Pope, submit the Eastern Orthodox Church to the authority of Rome. The Venetian leadership, seeing an opportunity to install a compliant pro-Venetian emperor and settle old grievances, strongly advocated for accepting the deal. After contentious debate, the Crusades' leaders agreed, sealing the city's fate. In 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived before the walls of Constantinople. Following an initial assault, the reigning emperor Alexios III fled, and Isaac II and his son Alexios IV were placed on the throne. However, the new co-emperor found the imperial treasury depleted and was incapable of fulfilling his extravagant promises. As he imposed new taxes to raise the funds, popular anti-Latin sentiment within the city boiled over into riots, leading to a palace coup in early 1204 that deposed the Angeloi and placed Alexios V Ducas on the throne. Alexios V immediately repudiated the agreement with the Crusaders, who were now stranded outside the city walls, unpaid and facing a hostile regime. The leaders of the crusade, driven by financial desperation and Venetian ambition, made the final unthinkable decision to conquer the greatest city in Christendom for themselves. Before the final assault commenced in April 1204, the leaders of the Fourth Crusade and their Venetian allies formalized their intentions by signing the Partitio Terrarum Imperii Romaniae, a treaty that meticulously detailed the division of the Byzantine Empire's territories and treasures amongst themselves. The first attack on the sea walls along the Golden Horn on April 9th was repulsed with heavy losses, but the resolve of the attackers did not break. On April 12th, they launched a second, more coordinated assault. Venetian galleys, their masts modified into flying bridges, succeeded in landing troops directly onto the battlements, while French knights breached a postern gate. The city's defences crumbled, and Emperor Alexios V Ducas fled into the night. What followed was not a simple conquest, but a 3-day sack of unimaginable brutality. The city was subjected to a systematic and pitiless pillage that violated the Crusaders' most sacred oaths. The great library was burned, its ancient manuscripts turned to ash. Countless classical bronze statues, including a colossal statue of Hercules by the famed sculptor Lysippos, were melted down for their metal. The 4 bronze horses that adorned the hippodrome were torn from their pedestal and shipped to Venice to be placed on the Basilica of St. Mark. The sanctity of churches offered no protection. The Hagia Sophia itself was desecrated. Crusaders drank from sacred chalices, a prostitute was placed upon the Patriarch's throne, and the high altar, a masterpiece of gold and precious stones, was smashed to pieces and divided among the soldiers. Monasteries and convents were plundered, and nuns were violated. The city's vast repository of holy relics, arguably the greatest in Christendom, was systematically looted. Fragments of the true cross, the crown of thorns, and the head of John the Baptist were stolen and dispersed throughout Western Europe. The violence against the civilian population was indiscriminate, with contemporary accounts detailing widespread murder and rape. Fires set during the chaos destroyed nearly 1/6 of the city. When the 3 days concluded, the accumulated wealth of 1,000 years had been stripped away, and the cultural and spiritual heart of the Orthodox world had been irrevocably shattered. The Byzantine Empire, as a contiguous and powerful state, ceased to exist, its capital now the seat of a fragile Latin kingdom, built upon a foundation of sacrilege and betrayal. Following the conquest, the Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, electing Baldwin of Flanders as its first emperor over the more powerful Boniface of Montferrat, largely due to Venetian fears of a strong rival controlling the straits. The Partitio Romaniae Treaty was immediately put into effect, granting Venice direct control over 3/8 of the former empire's territories, including the most valuable ports and islands like Crete and Corfu, ensuring its maritime and commercial supremacy. The Latin Empire itself was a fragile feudal state, a patchwork of lordships granted to Frankish knights, superimposed over a resentful and hostile Greek population. From its inception, it was politically unstable and militarily vulnerable, facing immediate challenges from the Bulgarian Empire to the north under the formidable Tsar Kaloyan, who would capture and kill Emperor Baldwin at the Battle of Adrianople in 1205, less than a year after his coronation. While the Latins struggled to consolidate their hold on Thrace and Greece, the shattered remnants of Byzantine power coalesced into 3 distinct successor states, each claiming to be the legitimate heir of the Roman Empire. In western Anatolia, Theodore Lascaris, a son-in-law of the former Emperor Alexios III, established the Empire of Nicaea. He successfully repelled Seljuk advances and meticulously recreated the Byzantine government in exile, complete with a patriarch, a senate, and a professional army, positioning Nicaea as the political and ideological center of the resistance. In western Greece, another aristocrat, Michael Komnenos Doukas, founded the Despotate of Epirus. A formidable military power, Epirus became Nicaea's primary rival for the imperial inheritance, often allying with Latin and Slavic powers in its bid to recapture Constantinople first. Far to the east, on the southern coast of the Black Sea, Alexios and David Komnenos, grandsons of Emperor Andronikos I, founded the Empire of Trebizond just before the sack of the capital. Geographically isolated and sustained by trade, Trebizond would pursue its own distinct political destiny, outlasting all other Byzantine entities. The next half-century was therefore not simply a struggle between Greeks and Latins, but a complex civil war among the Byzantine successor states, with Nicaea and Epirus battling each other for the right to reclaim the imperial city, while the Latin Empire bled resources trying to defend a conquest it could never truly govern. The Empire of Nicaea became the center of a methodical and patient multi-generational project aimed at restoring the Roman world. Under its first ruler, Theodore I Lascaris, the immediate priorities were survival and consolidation. He established a functioning government, a mint, and an army, successfully defending his Anatolian heartland against both Seljuk incursions and Latin aggression. It was his successor, John III, Ducas Vatatzes, who transformed Nicaea into a formidable economic and military power. Vatatzes was a brilliant administrator who implemented a strict policy of economic self-sufficiency, focusing on developing agriculture and local industries to free the state from reliance on foreign imports. He established imperial estates that became models of productivity, and his fiscal prudence rebuilt the treasury to a level not seen in centuries, allowing him to finance a powerful military without imposing crippling taxes on his subjects. Diplomatically, the Nicaean emperors played a complex game, forming alliances with the Second Bulgarian Empire against the Latins, while also engaging in correspondence with the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, exploring options for church union in exchange for political support. Militarily, they eschewed reckless attempts to storm Constantinople, opting instead for a strategy of gradual encirclement and attrition. They systematically expanded their territory in Anatolia and began a methodical reconquest of Byzantine lands in the Balkans, clashing frequently with their chief Greek rival, the Despotate of Epirus. The decisive turning point came in 1259 at the Battle of Pelagonia. The Nicaean army, commanded by the general Michael Palaiologos, achieved a stunning victory over a coalition of the Despotate of Epirus, the Frankish Principality of Achaia, and troops from the King of Sicily. The battle shattered Epirote power and neutralized the most significant Latin threats in Greece, leaving the Latin Empire in Constantinople isolated and vulnerable. Throughout these 57 years of exile, Nicaea was more than a military state. It was the custodian of Byzantine identity. The Orthodox Patriarchate was re-established there, providing spiritual legitimacy, while the imperial court maintained its elaborate protocols. This long, disciplined struggle, built on economic stability, diplomatic maneuvering, and strategic patience, created the conditions that made the eventual, almost anticlimactic, recapture of the capital not just possible, but inevitable. The restoration of Byzantine rule in Constantinople occurred not as the climax of a grand military campaign, but through a stroke of unforeseen luck. In July 1261, the Nicaean Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos had concluded a 2-year truce with the Latin Empire. Yet he dispatched his general, Alexios Strategopoulos, with a small force of around 800 soldiers into Thrace to monitor Bulgarian movements and maintain a watch on the capital. While near the city, Strategopoulos learned from local independent farmers, known as Thelemaitario, that the bulk of the Latin garrison and the entire Venetian fleet were absent, engaged in a raid against the Nicaean island of Daphnusia in the Black Sea. The capital was almost completely defenseless. Recognizing this unique opportunity, Strategopoulos made the audacious decision to exceed his orders. On the night of July 25, 1261, a small detachment of his men, guided by the local sympathizers, found an unguarded passage in the city walls. They entered, undetected, overpowered the few remaining guards at the Gate of the Spring, and opened the way for the rest of the Nicaean force. The surprise was total. The remaining Latin inhabitants were roused from their sleep by the sounds of the Nicaean soldiers sweeping through the streets. The Latin emperor, Baldwin II, was awakened by the commotion and fled in terror, abandoning his regalia and escaping to the harbour, where he found a Venetian merchant ship to carry him to safety. The city fell with barely a fight. Strategopoulos, to prevent any Venetian counterattack, immediately set fire to the Venetian quarter, a blaze which caused significant damage. When the news reached Michael VIII, he was asleep in his camp in Anatolia. His sister Eulogia woke him, but he initially dismissed the report as a dream. Only upon receiving Baldwin's abandoned crown and scepter did he accept the reality of his general's astonishing achievement. On August 15, 1261, Michael VIII made his triumphal entry into Constantinople through the Golden Gate, a carefully orchestrated ceremony designed to evoke the imperial triumphs of old and legitimize his rule. The Byzantine Empire was formally restored, but the city Michael inherited was a depopulated and dilapidated shadow of its former glory. A hollowed-out prize that would face immense challenges in the centuries to come. Paradoxically, as the restored Byzantine Empire entered its terminal decline, it experienced a final, intense burst of intellectual and artistic life. This Palaeologan Renaissance, flourishing from the late 13th to the early 15th century, was not a product of imperial wealth, but of a determined, scholarly elite clinging to its classical heritage amidst political disintegration. A central figure was the statesman and polymath Theodore Metochites, who served under Emperor Andronikos II. Metochites was a prodigious scholar who wrote extensively on philosophy, rhetoric, and astronomy, and he used his personal fortune to fund the restoration of the monastery of Street Saviour in Cora. The mosaics and frescoes he commissioned there represent the pinnacle of Palaeologan art. They broke from the static, hieratic style of earlier periods, displaying a new naturalism, emotional depth, and dynamic narrative composition. Figures are rendered with a sense of volume and psychological intensity, their movements fluid and their expressions conveying complex human feeling. This artistic revival was mirrored by a renewed scholarly focus on classical Greek texts. Scholars meticulously copied, edited, and wrote commentaries on ancient authors, particularly Plato, whose works saw a major revival. This intellectual movement is often characterized as a form of Byzantine humanism, a deep engagement with the classical past that sought to synthesize it with Orthodox Christian theology. This activity was not confined to the capital. In the despotate of the Morea, the city of Mystras became a vibrant center of this late Renaissance, home to the Neoplatonist philosopher George Gemistos Plethon, whose lectures on Plato would later have a direct influence on the Italian Renaissance. The era was also marked by intense theological debate, most notably the Hesychast controversy. This dispute centered on the mystical practices of monks seeking direct experience of God through contemplative prayer. The defense of hesychasm by the theologian Gregory Palamas against its critics engaged the empire's finest minds, demonstrating that this cultural flowering was as much a spiritual and theological phenomenon as it was a secular or classical one. This final efflorescence of culture, occurring within a state that was territorially shrinking and economically impoverished, created a legacy that would outlive the empire itself. As Byzantine scholars began to flee westward from the advancing Ottomans, they carried with them the Greek manuscripts and the intellectual traditions of this Renaissance, providing a crucial catalyst for the burgeoning humanist movement in Italy. The restored empire's most catastrophic wounds were self-inflicted, delivered through a series of dynastic civil wars that consumed its remaining strength. The first and longest of these was the War of the Two Andronikoi, a conflict that pitted the aged Emperor Andronikos II against his own grandson, Andronikos III. The rupture began in 1320, after a tragic accident where retainers of the young Andronikos mistakenly killed his brother Manuel. Their father, the co-emperor Michael IX, died from grief, leading the old emperor to disinherit his grandson. In response, Andronikos III, supported by a faction of ambitious young aristocrats, including the wealthy John Cantacuzénos, raised the banner of revolt in 1321. The war that followed was not a continuous blaze, but a 7-year smouldering fire of intermittent campaigns, truces, and betrayals. Both sides depleted the state treasury to hire foreign mercenaries, Serbs, Bulgarians, and Turks, who plundered the Thracian countryside with impunity, destroying the agricultural heartland that supplied the capital. While the Palaeologoi fought for the throne, the empire's enemies seized the opportunity. In Anatolia, the Ottoman Turks, under Osman and later his son Orhan, methodically captured Byzantine cities, culminating in the fall of the major center of Prussia, or Bursa, in 1326, which became the first Ottoman capital. The war ended in 1328 with Andronikos III's triumph, but the victory was hollow. The empire was territorially diminished and financially shattered. An even more ruinous conflict erupted after Andronikos III's death in 1341. John Cantacuzénos made a bid for the throne against the regency for the young John V. Palaiologos. The resulting 6-year civil war was an unmitigated disaster. It drew in foreign powers on an unprecedented scale, with the Serbian king Stefan Dušan exploiting the chaos to conquer Macedonia, Albania, and most of Greece, creating a short-lived Serbian empire. Most fatally, to secure victory, Cantacuzénos repeatedly hired Ottoman Turkish mercenaries, granting them their first permanent military foothold in Europe when they occupied the fortress of Tsimpe on the Gallipoli Peninsula in 1352. These internal struggles systematically dismantled the empire's defences, bankrupted its government, and ceded its lands, leaving a fragmented and exhausted state entirely at the mercy of its neighbours. From the political fragmentation of post-Seljuk Anatolia, a new power began to coalesce on the very frontiers of the Byzantine state. The Ottomans emerged from a small Turkish principality, or beylik, in the northwestern region of Bithynia, under the leadership of a chieftain named Osman I. Their early success was fueled by a potent ideology that fused the nomadic warrior ethos of the Turkic peoples with the Islamic concept of holy war against the infidel, attracting Ghazi warriors from across the region. This strategic position bordering a Byzantine Empire crippled by internal conflict, provided the perfect environment for relentless expansion. Unlike their contemporaries, the Ottomans focused their energies methodically against the Christian state, transforming raids for plunder into a systematic campaign of conquest and settlement. Under Osman's son, Orhan, they captured the last major Byzantine cities in Anatolia. The port of Nicomedia fell in 1337, severing Constantinople's final land connection to its Asian territories. The Ottomans demonstrated a pragmatic genius for state building, readily adopting and adapting the administrative, fiscal, and military structures of the territories they conquered. They established a formidable military machine, centered on disciplined light cavalry and, most innovatively, the Janissaries. This elite infantry corps was created through the Devshirme system, a levy on Christian Balkan boys who were taken to the capital, converted to Islam, and trained into a fanatically loyal slave army directly serving the Sultan. Having consolidated their hold on Anatolia, their gaze turned to Europe. The capture of Gallipoli in 1354, following an earthquake that conveniently destroyed its walls, gave them an irreversible bridgehead across the Dardanelles. From this base, Sultan Murad I launched a sweeping conquest of the Balkans, crushing a Serbian army at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. This relentless advance effectively bypassed Constantinople, turning the once mighty imperial capital into an isolated Christian island in a sea of Ottoman territory. The Byzantine Empire was reduced to the city itself and a few scattered territories, completely surrounded by a new, dynamic, and inexorable power, whose ultimate goal was the capture of the city of Constantine. By the turn of the 15th century, the Roman Empire was a geopolitical fiction. Its effective territory had shrunk to the city of Constantinople, a sliver of surrounding Thrace, the semi-autonomous despotate of the Morea in southern Greece, and a few scattered Aegean islands. For decades, the emperors had existed as vassals to the Ottoman Sultan, obligated to pay annual tribute and provide military support to the very power that was consuming them. Emperor John V Palaiologos had been forced to accompany Sultan Murad I on campaigns, and his successor, Manuel II, was compelled to do the same for Murad's son, Bayezid I. The city itself was a shadow of its former glory. Its population had collapsed to perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, rattling within the vast enclosure of the Theodosian walls. Large districts had reverted to fields, vineyards, and orchards, interspersed with the ruins of abandoned palaces and forums. The state was functionally bankrupt, its traditional tax base in Anatolia and the Balkans long since lost. The once thriving commerce of the Golden Horn was now entirely in the hands of the Italian maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, whose fortified trading colony at Galata, just across the water, operated as a state within a state. In a desperate act of diplomacy, Manuel II, unprecedented journey to the west between 1399 and 1402, visiting Venice, Paris, and even London to plead in person for a military crusade, but he returned with only promises and financial subsidies. An unexpected reprieve came not from the west, but from the east. In 1402, the Turco-Mongol conqueror Timur crushed Sultan Bayezid's army at the Battle of Ankara, shattering Ottoman power and plunging their state into a decade-long civil war. This interregnum granted Byzantium several decades of borrowed time. The final attempt to secure aid was theological. Emperor John VIII Palaiologos attended the Council of Ferrara-Florence, and in 1439 formally agreed to the union of the churches, submitting to papal authority. The union was overwhelmingly rejected by his own clergy and populace, and the promised crusade it was meant to inspire culminated in a catastrophic Christian defeat by the Ottomans at the Battle of Varna in 1444. With this last hope extinguished, the empire was left a lonely bastion, awaiting the arrival of a new sultan with the ambition and the means to finish the conquest. The ascension of Constantine XI Palaiologos in 1449 initiated the final, most desperate phase of Byzantine diplomacy. His reign began with an immediate dispatch of envoys to the west, renewing pleas for a military league to save the city from the inevitable Ottoman assault. The primary destination for these appeals was Rome, where Pope Nicholas V made his position unequivocally clear. Substantial military aid would only be forthcoming after the union of the churches, agreed upon at Florence, was formally and publicly proclaimed within Hagia Sophia. This demand placed Constantine in an impossible position, caught between the existential threat from the Ottomans and the intractable opposition of his own people. The anti-unionist faction, led by the influential scholar George Scholarios, dominated the city's spiritual life, fostering a popular sentiment encapsulated in the bitter phrase, "Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat." A grand crusade, however, was a political fantasy in mid-15th century Europe. France and England were still reeling from the conclusion of the 100 Years' War. The Holy Roman Empire under Frederick III was a decentralized entity incapable of unified action. The once mighty crusading force of Hungary was still rebuilding after the Varna disaster, with its regent John Hunyadi focused on defending his own borders. The Italian maritime republics, the only powers with the naval strength to make a difference, were guided by commercial pragmatism. Venice, a direct commercial rival to the Ottomans, was reluctant to provoke a full-scale war, while the Republic of Genoa declared official neutrality, though it permitted its citizens to act on their own initiative. Consequently, the aid that materialized was piecemeal and largely private. In a last-ditch effort to satisfy the Pope, Constantine allowed Cardinal Isidore of Kiev to formally celebrate the union in Hagia Sophia in December 1452, a ceremony boycotted by most of the populace and which only deepened the city's internal schism. The most significant help came not from a king, but from a Genoese professional soldier, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who arrived in January 1453 at his own expense, with 2 ships and 700 heavily armed troops. This small, dedicated contingent represented the entirety of the West's meaningful response, leaving the last Roman emperor to defend a divided city with a handful of foreign allies against the full might of the Ottoman war machine. Upon his second accession to the Ottoman throne in 1451, the 19-year-old Sultan Mehmed II possessed a singular, all-consuming ambition: the conquest of Constantinople. He immediately initiated preparations on a scale that dwarfed all previous attempts. In 1452, as a direct challenge to Byzantine sovereignty and a clear prelude to war, he constructed a massive fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly opposite an existing Ottoman castle on the Asian shore. This new fortress, Rumeli Hizura, or Throat Cutter, was completed in a mere 4 months, and gave the Ottomans absolute control of the strait, severing the city's crucial Black Sea trade routes. While this strategic construction was underway, Mehmed assembled a vast army, estimated to number at least 80,000 regular troops, supported by tens of thousands of irregulars. The core of this force was the elite Janissary Corps, slave soldiers loyal only to the Sultan, alongside vast numbers of Anatolian and Balkan infantry and Sipahi cavalry. But the Sultan's true innovation lay in his embrace of gunpowder technology. The key figure in this technological leap was a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had first offered his services to Constantine XI. The bankrupt empire, however, could not afford his fees. Mehmed II welcomed Orban with immense resources and a simple directive: to build cannons that could shatter the walls of Babylon itself. Working at the foundry in the Ottoman capital of Edirne, Orban produced a series of large bombards. His masterpiece was a supergun of unprecedented scale, later known as the Basilic. This bronze cannon was over 27 feet long, with walls 8 inches thick, and capable of firing a 1,200-pound stone ball over a mile. The logistical effort to move this behemoth was immense. requiring a crew of several hundred men and 60 oxen to drag it over specially prepared roads to the siege lines. Alongside this giant, Orban cast dozens of other large-caliber cannons, creating the most formidable siege train the world had yet seen. A fleet of over 100 ships was assembled under the command of Admiral Baltaulu to blockade the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara. By early 1453, this meticulously prepared force of overwhelming numbers, logistical superiority, and revolutionary artillery was in place, ready to unleash a technological fury against fortifications designed in a bygone age of warfare. Facing the vast Ottoman host, the defense of Constantinople was a study in numerical futility. Constantine XI could muster a garrison of no more than 7,000 fighting men to defend 14 miles of fortifications. This small force was a patchwork of diverse loyalties and origins. It included approximately 5,000 Byzantine soldiers, drawn from the city's depleted professional ranks and civilian militia, alongside a crucial contingent of around 2,000 foreign volunteers. The Genoese contingent, led by the professional soldier of fortune Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, was the most significant, providing expertise in siege defense and shoring up the most critical sections of the land walls. The Venetian community, under the command of their bailo Girolamo Minotto, also committed to the defense, alongside a small number of independent soldiers, including a group of Ottoman defectors under Prince Orhan and a contingent of Catalan troops. Constantine XI himself provided the central pillar of the defense, tirelessly inspecting the fortifications, directing repair crews, and mediating disputes between the Genoese and Venetians. The Ottoman bombardment began on April 6, 1453, with the great cannons pounding the central section of the Theodosian walls. For 53 days the defenders endured a relentless assault. Each night, under the emperor's supervision, work crews of soldiers and civilians toiled to repair the breaches with earth, rubble, and wooden stockades. A significant early success for the defenders came on April 20th, when 4 Genoese ships managed to break through the Ottoman naval blockade to deliver vital supplies. The most decisive strategic blow, however, was struck by Mehmed II. On April 22nd, he executed an audacious engineering feat, bypassing the Great Chain protecting the Golden Horn by having his lighter warships dragged overland on a greased timber roadway into the harbour. This move forced the defenders to stretch their already thin forces to cover the weaker sea walls. As May progressed, the situation grew desperate. On May 28th, with a final grand assault imminent, a solemn procession carried the city's holy icons along the walls, followed by a final, unified Christian service in Hagia Sophia, where Latin Catholics and Greek Orthodox prayed together. In the pre-dawn hours of May 29th, the final Ottoman assault began. The initial waves of irregular Bashi-bazooks were repulsed, followed by a more determined attack from Anatolian regiments. The critical moment came when Giovanni Giustiniani was gravely wounded, and his withdrawal from the front line caused a panic among the Genoese defenders. At this point of collapse, Ottoman janissaries exploited a small, unlocked postern gate, the Kirka Porta, and established a foothold inside the city. Realizing the end had come, Constantine XI cast off his imperial regalia and, with his last comrades, charged into the oncoming tide of janissaries, where he was killed in the anonymous chaos of the final struggle. His death marked the end of the line of Roman emperors and the fall of the city that had stood for 1,123 years.